So this unit will be used to tackle 8 standards from roughly the 30 that the state asked us to cover. So if you look from the top, we're looking at alternative courses of action, standard 1, standard 2's tackling primary versus secondary sources. We will look at that as well. You guys will explore these throughout this unit. 3, we're going to use, I'm going to come up with a thesis here, and we're going to use evidence to support that thesis. And historians analyze cause and effect. That's 4. We're going to look at globalization here pretty early on. It has positive, but it also has negative effects. And then we're looking at 16, which is oppression and discrimination, looking at the Holocaust, which I'm sure most of you are familiar with. 23, the breakup of the Soviet Union, which we're going to conclude with in the next unit with the Cold War. But again, we're going to be introduced to it in this unit. Lastly, many groups, politically and culturally, will struggle for independence and to determine their own future. That's 25. So, without further ado, we're looking at this unit, this terrorism. We're going to start with 9/11. And my argument is, my thesis, the victims of 9/11 were a result of causation from past events. As you know, we've talked about already, looking at the sound of thunder, causation plays a role in history. We're looking at cause and effect. And my argument is, these victims of 9/11, roughly 3,000, will come as a result of the past. It will be the past events that get them killed. Now, according to standard number 3, there's my argument, but I need evidence. So my job will be to give you evidence of why. Now, when we're looking at these things here, the victims, we need to understand that terrorism and events in the present are because of these things in the past. They help us explain why things are what they are today. So if you could for me, click on this video, just kind of capture the emotions of 9/11. It's about 4 minutes. Just kind of see the horrors of that day for multiple Americans. And it's a flashbulb memory, as we call it in psychology, where if you were old enough to have a memory, you would definitely remember where you were at this time. So we need to be conscious of the role of 9/11. We need to be conscious of globalization. Globalization, you're looking at the world as shrinking figuratively. Thanks to technology, the advancements of it is allowing people, ideas, cultures to travel greater distances and faster than ever before, which we have this communication sharing, which is a positive thing in many regards. However, there are some negative drawbacks. First off, to make it relevant to you, a lot of you are just glued on your phones all day. We're zombies to this technology. We're almost becoming too dependent on it. When I ask you folks to think, some of us just want to go to Google. Let's Google it instead of actually drawing these conclusions on our own. So, for all the positives, again, sharing ideas. We have this information, this wealth of information throughout the world, and it is something that is used to build off of that research. However, there are drawbacks. You're looking at, as a result of globalization, bringing products and bringing ideas faster and further. You have a lot more of a shared culture. You have more countries interdependent on one another, meaning as we looked at Saudi Arabia is interdependent with Japan. It brings in its vehicles, like the Lexus we studied with that girl, but it sends out oil. Those two countries are an example of interdependence. We are interdependent with countries for bringing in bananas, from bringing in some things that, again, we do not produce here, and we send stuff out as well. So you're looking at globalization again. If you could click on these two, there's 2 different links here. The one on the right explains what globalization is. The one on the left is going to look at maybe some relevance to you. Going on, looking at the negative consequence of technology, it is also used by terrorist organizations to recruit more terrorists. Again, if you're spreading information, it doesn't have to be positive information. It can be negative information to inflict harm on others. ISIS is very good at using YouTube and Skype and social media sources like Facebook to get its message out there, either whether it's subtly or if it's straight up in your face. So we need to understand this technology has been used by both good and bad people, both good and bad cultures, good and bad groups. But as we learned on 9/11, we talked about geography as one of America's strengths. It has been these oceans which kept us from invasion. We've obviously been attacked at Pearl Harbor, which most of you are probably familiar with. But again, that's over in Hawaii, out in the Pacific. Our continental United States has not been attacked since the War of 1812. So if we look at this, we find out on 9/11 that these oceans, thanks to this technology, these oceans can no longer protect us. These can be this gap can be bridged by extremists and radicals. We find out on that fateful day of 9/11 that what happens over there in Afghanistan, what happens over there in Iran, what happens over there in North Korea, it all matters to America because of this globalization, because the world is connected. So again, we need to be familiar and conscious of that and the role of globalization on everyday life. We need to make sure, again, we're conscious of the fact that in history, there is psychology. They go hand in hand, and they're rooted within one another. Now, as a result, speaking of psychology, we tend to overfeel as human beings and underthink. We react with our emotions too often instead of thinking things through. We're more irrational than we are rational. We do not think logically. Again, we are stirred by emotions. We react to these emotions rather than thinking things through. So how does this tie in? First off, this chart just shows you the threat, and then focus on terrorists, but look at the cause of death and lifetime odds. You can see that cancer is way, way more prominent than something like being killed by an asteroid or a shark attack, or for that matter, an illegal immigrant terrorist. You have a 1 in 138 million chance to die by an illegal immigrant terrorist, or a refugee terrorist, 1 in 46 million. So we need to look and understand that terrorism poses such a small threat. And if we look here, though, even though we're 3 times more likely to get killed by a lightning strike than terrorists, check out on the bottom right-hand side, check out the federal budget. $150 billion. So we need, again, make sure we understand and look at how we overfeel and underthink. It's the terrorists who are going to get us to react with emotion. Now, a good metaphor to understand terrorism, and again, I'm going to put a link on here. It's a short little clip that you're going to read, short little excerpt, I should say, is think of terrorists like a fly in a china shop. A fly itself can't knock over and destroy the china shop. It just doesn't have the power to do that. That are terrorists. They cannot inflict much damage. Their job is to inflict fear and to stir the emotions. And that's what they do, metaphorically speaking. A fly can do a lot of damage if it gets in the ear of a bull and buzzes it, irritates it, and gets the bull to destroy the china shop. And this is kind of the terrorist's goal, is to stir up the bull. And this is what terrorists attempt to do because they themselves are weak. They can inflict damage. 9/11 is definitely an example. That's the height of the damage they can inflict, which was drastic. However, they're looking for America, superpowers, to respond with a force. And this is what America is going to do after 9/11. We're going to destroy parts of the Middle East, creating situations on the ground that we're dealing with today as a result of it. So again, we need to be conscious of that. Looking at psychology, heuristics, these are mental shortcuts we take. And so the availability heuristic, looking at psychology and our history go hand in hand, and how it impacts our present day, is due to the fact that heuristics are mental shortcuts that we take, our minds take, to make decisions quickly. Because of the images of 9/11 in our head have been seared there from years and years and exposure of these events 17 years ago, this is what we see. So because that's what we see, we assume that flying is dangerous. We assume that it is safer to drive than fly because of availability heuristics. And this little cartoon, the guy states they must have a death wish to swim in that water. Based off of seeing and reading from the media about these shark attacks, he thinks shark attacks are very likely. But if you go back to here, a shark attack's 1 in 8 million. As he smokes his cig, it looks at cancer, 1 in 7. So again, availability heuristics, what we see is what we believe. So the most dangerous thing you need to worry about when you fly is driving to the airport. Now, the other heuristic I want you guys to understand is, looking at the psychology, representative heuristic. Based off the fact that all 19 hijackers were Middle Eastern descent, we were looking at, when we see sometimes Middle Easterners, we assume that because that representative heuristic, because that 9/11 images, that they also represent terrorists. And I say we, I mean a percentage of Americans. So again, we need to make sure we're conscious to that and remind ourselves that based off statistics, the chances of a Middle Eastern being a terrorist are slim, almost slim to none. So again, just making sure we're conscious of that to affect our behavior in the present. Now, the question I have for all of us is, does 9/10 matter? That was a question I had. Does a day before 9/11 matter? And if I go back here, I go back to my thesis, my argument is yes, it does. But we need to make sure we're conscious of the fact that the world from 9/10 to 9/11 is drastically different. It's like, that 24 hours makes a world of difference. Because of these attacks, the world changes. And the reason why we need to make sure we understand why the world changes is America is a superpower. And we know globalization. Now, a superpower is a country that has the means and the ability to affect multiple countries throughout the world at the same time, simultaneously. America has multiple bases, thousands of bases throughout the world. So because of that, we're able to dictate events other places. And because 9/11 hit America at the heart of a city like New York City, we're going to make changes that impact the world. That, again, shows you the power of globalization. It shows you the power of America. We are the only superpower now left after the Soviet Union collapsed in 1991. China's looking to become a superpower one day, but they're more of a regional power right now. They affect and dictate events that happen in their region. They're not yet a superpower. That day may come. But the world did change because of 9/11. We need to be conscious of that. America is much more involved in like, for example, Afghanistan, Iraq, even the Middle East. America's, we talk about security of airports. Just America has changed its approach in the world. And those things that happen over there now matter more to America. We, again, are conscious of the fact that these oceans don't protect us the same as they did a century ago. Because of 9/11, we have still fighting this war on terrorism, which we're going to investigate in more depth. If we look at 9/11, you guys can tell me what happened. You guys can tell me, there's roughly 3,000 Americans killed. You would tell me there's 19 hijackers, 15 are from Saudi Arabia. Of all 19 are from the Middle Eastern region. You guys could tell me that there was 4 planes hijacked that morning. 2 of them hit the World Trade Center, 1 hit the Pentagon, 1 ended up in a field in PA. However, you guys can also, tell me that Osama bin Laden was a mastermind. But most of you guys do not know that KSM is the guy, because Khalid Sheikh Mohammed was the guy that actually masterminded the terrorist attacks in regards to coming up with the idea to fly planes into American targets, soft targets. And this will be his decision. Osama bin Laden will be the one who funds it. And KSM is currently in Guantanamo Bay, which is a prison, American prison in Cuba. So again, make sure we're conscious. And then looking at question we should ask is, why do we have a base in Cuba, especially if our relations with Cuba aren't so great? Again, that answer lies in history. I had a philosophical question. What killed these people on 9/11? Was it the push or the fall? And I know that's a philosophical question. It could be debated for hours. What kills a person, the push or the fall? But my argument is the push is more important to know. Again, we can answer what happened, but we don't answer why it happened. And why is more important because the why gives us the motive. And the motive, if we can be a detective and understand the motive, we can maybe prevent such a thing happening again. So we're going to look and explore the motive of these terrorists, what drove them to do such a heinous act on American soil. Why are they 15 of them from Saudi Arabia? So my argument, going back to the thesis, is that the butterfly effect. One event causes another, which causes another, which causes another. The argument is, over a century ago, the seeds were planted for 9/11. And 9/11 was just the harvest for the Grim Reaper. And death came to those people because of those seeds that were planted a long time ago, which would have been an indirect cause of 9/11, but a cause nonetheless. And the dates that I put up here that you folks are doing for your honors project are, as you see here, these 7 dates. And I think I had you guys just do 6. But we look at this. These are my arguments, and I need to provide evidence in this slideshow to give you to reinforce how these dates led to 9/11/2001. And if you start with 6/28/1914, that is when World War I is about to set off due to the assassination of the Archduke Franz Ferdinand, which then led to the secret agreement called the Sykes-Picot Accord on 5/19/1916, which is going to create the Middle East as we know it today, creating those borders. And again, we'll get into depth with that. On 5/14/1948, we'll see the creation of Israel. And this will be a problem, again, that we will discuss. 8/19/1953, American CIA backs an overthrow of the Iranian democracy, the Iranian government. On 12/24/1979, you see the Soviet Union invade Afghanistan, which is going to be a decade-long struggle for the Soviets and the Afghans. You see on 8/8/1990, Americans are going to use Saudi Arabia's base to launch an invasion on Iraq in the Persian Gulf War. On 12/25/1991, you're looking at the collapse of the Soviet Union, which again, we're going to investigate in depth. We need to remind ourselves that each of these events, there was a choice and there was a consequence. On this slide, I want you folks to jump on here and I want you guys to read The Road Not Taken by Robert Frost. And I want you guys to have a discussion. We'll probably do it. We will do it in class. Maybe has even created an illustration. But we're looking at, for every cause, there's a consequence. For every cause, there's effect. For every choice, there's a consequence. And we'd understand that once those decisions are made on these dates, there's no turning back. They have been made. Now, the dominoes, again, going back to the thesis that the victims of 9/11 were a result of the causation from the past. The past killed them. That first domino, again, my argument, and I need to build a case to this, is the fact that, and this is what historians do, I'm not a historian, but as a teacher, but historians are going to make an argument how one thing leads to another. And we must understand the first domino, we're using in this case as the assassination of the Archduke, led to the last domino we're studying, which would be 9/11. So it indirectly caused it, but again, we're making sure we understand that argument. Now, here's a story again I want you guys to click on. This is, you're introduced to the soldier on the left, Jonathan Taylor, and a photographer on the right, Lindsay Adario, I believe her name is, and it's going to capture a story and understanding how history plays a role on the present. So we must ask the power of history. History does matter. It impacts events all the way up to the present day, and 9/11 is still killing people today. These events of the past are still killing people today because those choices made have made the present day the way it is. Just, again, I want to make sure I cannot emphasize that enough. 60 words you're looking at, that the President is authorized to use all necessary and appropriate force against those nations, organizations, or person who determines, planned, authorized, committed, or aided the terrorist attacks that occurred on September 11, 2001, or harbored such organizations or persons in order to prevent any future act of international terrorism against the United States by such nations, organizations, or persons. These are 60 words that authorized President Bush to do what he wanted on the war on terror. And again, we'll dissect these in class. We see with this the power of words. Words are a powerful thing. Language is a powerful thing. And we see with Arnold's biceps here in his prime, okay, just how powerful they are. And there's a saying that the pen is mightier than the sword. And we see this throughout history. We'll discuss why this is in class as well. But we must ask, where do these 60 words originate? And that's where I want you folks to look into the USS Maddox and something called the Gulf of Tonkin Resolution, which again, I will have you guys do in class when we get to. And again, we're going to reinforce that the drone strikes to the invasion of Afghanistan, Iraq, to Guantanamo Bay, to the wall in Vietnam, there's a connection in all of them. For example, the Vietnam conflict, due to the 58,000 plus Americans killed there in Vietnam, will lead to the public outcry of getting us out of war in that conflict, which will lead to the military changing its tactics, our government changing its tactics in war. This is why we use drone strikes. If a drone shot down, there's no loss of life. There's no loss of life. People don't get outraged by the fact that Americans were killed. So we must understand that the past causes the present. It dictates the present events. We learned from Vietnam that the American public will turn on the government if there are too many body bags coming home from American boys or girls. So again, we must stop and think how we're fighting the wars. These wars today are based off past events. So again, we must remind ourselves everything is connected. Nothing ever exists entirely alone. Everything is in relation to everything else. It goes back to that sound of thunder, that cause and effect relationship that is paramount to history and to you buying into what we do. Now, we must stop and think this war on terror. We are impacted by Vietnam to this day. Is this war on terror going to lead to a famous wall like this that is remembered for obviously the people who bravely fought in Vietnam and honors them, but also is a painful reminder of getting involved in countries far from home? Or is it going to end like this? The most famous kiss in American history, the famous kiss between the sailor and the nurse to end World War II, which this actually signifies the end of a war. We haven't had an official ending to a war since this kiss. So again, we need to make sure we stop and we're conscious about the world we live in and the way history plays a role in it. In the next chapter, next lecture, next video, I'm going to talk about the Middle East, how it's created. That'll be part 2. And again, I hope you enjoyed this. We'll get into some critical thinking with this in class next week. So appreciate you guys and girls. You guys are awesome. Until next time.